Hello, everyone. I hope you are well today. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and today's live is about the right to read inquiry and why the recommendations really are best practices. I have the pleasure to have Dr. Stephen Dykstra join me today, and we're going to go through some of the recommendations. So, hi, Dr. Stephen Dykstra. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us. Would you like to say a little bit about yourself so people know how you put your perspective?
Yeah, let me explain how we've all got our own explanation of how we ended up in this place and on this journey and in this struggle, in this field. I come to this as a psychologist. I work primarily in children's mental health. That's my regular day job, the thing that I do. I had some exposure to literacy and reading as a developmental process, some exposure to the early ideas of learning disability and dyslexia when I was in graduate school. I had one professor who was very much an expert in that. He warned us in the 1980s that there was a way of teaching kids reading out there that was going to be a problem. It was bad. It was catching on. He predicted it was going to be a big problem. It was going to hurt a lot of kids. I didn't really think about that very much. Then my own child started going to school in the early 90s. And I ran into it. And I remember thinking, oh, this is what my professor talked about. Got busy with raising kids and doing my job, and that didn't come up. And then it sort of went underground for a while in my life, and it kept coming up and kept coming up. And I was drawn into this. And, I don't do reading research, but I read research. I talk about research. I help people understand research. And I think I've developed something of a reputation as an explainer of science to people who maybe aren't entirely familiar with science.
Yes, and that's an important role because we really need to help bridge the gap between research and practice when it comes to education. And when we start talking about the recommendations made from the Right to Read public inquiry, we can see how they're trying to move away from this idea of a whole language or a balanced literacy approach to instruction and more towards a structured literacy or a science of reading instruction. And there are thousands and thousands of journal articles out there, and we're not expecting teachers to go and read them and spend time. We know that their time is limited. We're just trying to get the information out there in a way that they can understand it.
Right. And I have a lot of experience in my professional life as a mental health practitioner with trying to translate science into research. And that sounds like the easiest thing. Look at the science says do this, we do this. Sometimes in healthcare or working with human beings or providing treatment, in education is a kind of a treatment. It's something we do for people, for children mostly, to try to help them accomplish something or change in some way, learn something. Sometimes it's a very easy, direct thing to do. We tell a doctor, stop prescribing this medicine, prescribe this medicine. We thought this amount was the right way, give this amount instead, and everything changes, and it's very direct, research to practice. In many cases, translating research into practice, and this is certainly true in education, is much more indirect and much more challenging than that. We see a piece of evidence here, a piece of evidence here, a piece of evidence here, a piece of evidence here. And the space between that evidence may not be nearly as clear. And we have to understand that and interpret that and work with that and wrestle with that and honor the science we have while filling in the gaps between it.
Yeah, well, and the first thing that I think we should talk about is something that's referred to scientifically. It's orthographic mapping. And that's how we learn how to read words so that it's almost instantaneous within a fraction of the section. So we're not trying to sound them out. And that's our goal, is for kids to have words orthographically mapped or in their visual word formed area. Now that's a bunch of jargon. Do you want to just take a minute to explain what we're really talking about here?
So one of the challenges of talking about this, and I didn't talk about this, we sort of had a little pre-conference beforehand, but one of the things we should bring up is when you read about orthographic mapping, when you try to learn about orthographic mapping, that term is sometimes used to refer to two different but very closely related things, but they are different. One is the sort of mechanical rote process of associating letters with sounds and blending them together, blending the sounds together to create a word, and doing that in a kind of intentional way based on your knowledge of phonics and your ability to apply phonological awareness and phonemic awareness to a word. It also is used to describe the almost miraculous, it's probably not the right word, but the almost miraculous process by which, as you point out, we go from reading words kind of laboriously and mechanically and sounding them out sound by sound, chunk by chunk, part by part, to where we can decode 5, 6, we can recognize, we're not even decoding anymore, 5, 6, 7 words per second, very automatically, so fast we don't even know how we're doing it. That's how we deal with, that's orthographic mapping. That's how we read words that are already orthographically mapped. How we do that, as far as we can tell, is that we have deep experiences, often repeated experiences, with the spelling of a word, the orthography, the letters that represent the word, the sounds of that word with a recognition of how the sounds and the letters correspond to each other, but also experience with the word, using the word, understanding the meaning of the word, having experience with the word in both reading it and writing it and using it. And so we establish a very broad understanding of the word. We have a lot of experience with the word. Now, of all of those experiences with the word, the most essential seem to be the sounds and the letters. Once you get good at orthographic mapping, you can orthographically map words that you don't even know what they mean. You can orthographically map words in a language that you don't even understand. But you have to get pretty good at it to do that. And in the beginning, when we're orthographically mapping our first words as young readers, it's slow and laborious, and we may have to have lots of experiences, half a dozen or more experiences with a word before it has a chance to get orthographically mapped, and that orthographic mapping may still be a little slow and insecure. But as we orthographically map more words, and those pathways in the left side of our brain get better and better, and the area that stores those words gets more and more fluent and skilled and robust, we become aware as skilled adult readers that I may only have to see a word and encounter a word once or twice, and it can become automatic for me. That's really the pinnacle of orthographic mapping. When you can do that, that's what we're trying to get everybody to. And one of the things I want to stress is that while orthographic mapping involves memory, it certainly includes the ability to remember things. It looks a lot like just memory, you're just memorizing words. It's much more than that. The cognitive scientists tell us you can't remember things as fast as we recognize words. As fast as we can recognize familiar words in text and read a line, a paragraph, a page, a book, a chapter of text, as fast as we can do that, you can't remember 1,000 words that fast, but you can recall them. You can trigger them in your brain through this process of orthographic mapping and recall much faster than you can simply remember something. And that process, the miracle of that process, lets us read quickly and fluently in a way we could not otherwise.
Yes, and it's important that we align our teaching practices in ways that are going to help facilitate that. So I'm going to take a moment and share my screen with you so you're familiar with the recommendations that we're going to be discussing in this conversation. Now, the first relate to curriculum and instruction.
Right.
And here we're looking at kindergarten all the way to grade 8 and making sure that the curriculum really enforces this ability for us to orthographically map words and other skills that we need to become confident, fluent readers. Now, while these recommendations were made specifically for Ontario, they can be applied to a larger body. They really work for any English language instruction and arguably other languages too, because it's promoting best practices for teaching reading. one of the first things they're talking about is removing references to queuing systems and guessing strategies for word reading. And that really is highlighting how we want to make sure that the students are getting the best opportunity and the best practices for learning how to read the word and orthographically map it.
You know, you can make the argument, and I certainly would make the argument, that what sets these standards apart from any other I've seen in the English-speaking world, where all English-speaking countries are wrestling with the same question about what to do about some of these ways we've taught reading for the last number of decades, and the problems with that, is the courage and the forthrightness to start out by saying, first of all, don't do this. Stop doing this. Stop talking about it. Stop doing it. Stop relying on it. That's really, as far as I know, pretty unique. Because it isn't enough to just say, hey, do some more of this, do some more phonics and phonemic awareness, and do some more of these exercises that promote orthographic mapping, if we're just mixing it in with all the old things we did. Because what people will say is, yeah, I'm doing that, but I'm not getting any results. It's not really helping. It's clear that this isn't the magic bullet that everybody said it was. It's not as good as everybody touts it out to be. But we're diluting that in too many of the old practices that we know are not a good idea. And there's more than even just telling people to stop do this. You know, A here tells people to stop doing it. B tells you, or anything else that's not been scientifically validated. If you had just one of those or the other, you would still leave room for people to do things that aren't a good idea. You know, I've seen a lot of people, there's a lot of standards around the country and around the world that say, should only do things that are scientifically validated. And then what people do is they go back to guessing and MSV and queuing systems and all that. And you confront them about it and they say, oh yeah, that's scientifically validated. It's okay. Here we're saying, don't do things that aren't scientifically validated. And you need to know queuing systems and guessing strategies are not scientifically validated. We're not open to the suggestion that they are, that we've decided on that. They're not. Stop doing it. Which is hard, you know, if that's the way you've always taught and that's what you were trained to do. That's very difficult to give that up.
Yeah, and one thing to highlight is a lot of the teacher education programs aren't teaching what is scientifically validated, and they are still focusing on some of the balanced literacy, whole language approaches. And a lot of our new teachers grew up learning how to read with those approaches, so they cannot draw on an experience where they had that systematic, explicit, direct instruction with those, you know, phonics programs and whatever.
You know, we're enough decades into this now that, as you point out, people who were taught to read using better methods, and not what I would call the science of reading. I was taught to read with phonics, but when I was taught to read in the 60s, nobody knew what phonemic awareness was. That wouldn't have come up. It certainly wouldn't have been done as explicitly or systematically as we should be doing it, but there was some attention to phonics, considerable attention to phonics. But people who have been taught to read in a better way, who have been taught to read absent some of these guessing strategies, nobody ever taught me to guess at a word. They're few and far between. And teachers who've taught that way have moved along and retired and aren't in the profession anymore. And so, as you point out, that sort of historic knowledge, that knowledge that sometimes is held by groups, that really important set of skills has dwindled. And so even if somebody says, well, okay, I want to do this, but how do you do it? It's very likely you can't turn to the person next to you and find somebody who'll say, I'll show you. You can't remember your own education and say, oh, I remember that. So that makes it harder to have this revolution. It makes it harder to teach people because the number of people who carry this knowledge with them and this experience with them is at a pretty low level. And so it's going to take a lot of effort to build this back up.
Definitely. And you do have those students that did struggle. And were dyslexic and had that systematic instruction outside of school to get them there. So there are some that do have this knowledge, plus the teachers that have worked with students that have struggled and searched for the knowledge themselves. So there are teachers that do have this knowledge, but it's not something that we've taught everybody. And it's piecemeal, taking pieces from things here and there.
Well, one of the things that's happened is we have lots of places sort of kind of try to teach this way a little bit for the kids who struggle the most. And they have a much less scientific approach for the great large body of kids. And one of the problems with that is that if you watch that and you're not systematically gathering data or reading the science, one impression you will get is, well, look, the kids who are getting this other kind of instruction, they're all learning to read much more easily than those kids over there getting that phonetic, phonics, science-based instruction. You don't immediately recognize, well, those are kids who are neurologically dyslexic. Those are kids who are going to struggle no matter how you teach them to read. And you don't have a group of typically developing readers who are being taught by the science of reading to compare to the kids who are getting balanced literacy. And so you get a misrepresentation of what's going on. The other thing that happens is, and this is understandable that this would happen. I mean, this happened. This has a lot to do with how balanced literacy and whole language became preeminent. And that is, if you watch the most gifted readers, the kids who are sort of the opposite of dyslexic kids. I have one son who was probably mildly dyslexic and one daughter who was a gifted natural reader. I mean, she just picked it up. You couldn't even figure out how she did it. It's like she learned to read by breathing. You know, when you watch kids like that, and there are kids like that, learn to read, they seem to learn to read just from being read to, just from seeing text. They pick this up, they figure it out on their own. Their brains are just wired really well for reading and language. And the impression you get is the best readers learn to read just by surrounding them with books and literature. That's what we should do for everybody. Then everybody can be a reader like this. That'll be really great. Everybody can be a reader. That's like finding some kid who picks up a set of golf clubs and goes out there without ever taking a lesson and goes out there and shoots par, the first time they golf. There are such people. But your impression from that is, see, the way to learn to play golf is don't take a lesson. Don't let anybody teach you anything. Just pick up clubs and go play. Because that one person did it, that's the best way. We don't recognize these are very special kids. We also don't recognize that if you taught those kids to read explicitly, they would learn to read even faster and better than they did. It seems like they couldn't possibly read better than this. But we know that if you infuse their instruction with more explicit instruction and more explicit experiences and more systematic instruction, they learn to read even better than they are. And, that is really eye-opening to people, because you think these kids are doing great. They couldn't possibly do better. Oh, yes, they can.
Especially when we start incorporating that morphological awareness and
Right.
start to help build their vocabulary and understanding of how our words come to be in the spelling when we're looking more at the etymology.
One of the really important things, and understand, I'm in the United States. I'm in Wisconsin right now. We do a terrible job in Wisconsin. We're trying to get that turned around. It's very, very difficult. There's tremendous opposition. But a number of states in the United States are doing better. No state is doing great. A reading advocate that I know from out east said that in their state, which does okay, they said we get it about half right with about half the kids about half the time. So that's a pretty stark admission. Yet in that state, as they improve to that level, the number of kids reading at the most advanced level on what we have in the States, the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, where the advanced category of reading is a very high bar. There's not many kids who get to advanced. When they implemented more science of reading and infused their standards with science and gave more science-based training to practicing teachers, they didn't require them to do anything. There's nothing this good. It was nothing this clear. They just did some stuff. It raised up kids from the bottom, which was always the plan, but it also pushed kids up who were already at the top. The number of kids at the advanced level more than doubled. And when other states did it, that happens over and over again. They're trying to raise up kids from the bottom, but the same science and the same training and the same methods takes kids at the top who are proficient and makes them advanced, takes kids who are advanced and makes them, if I can make up a new category, very advanced. In state after state, jurisdiction after jurisdiction, the same things we do to raise kids up from the bottom doubles or more than doubles the percentage of kids at the top. That's extraordinary. That's something because one of the selling points of balanced literacy and whole language is this falsehood that, well, yeah, there's some kids who need that scientific instruction. They seem to be relenting on that now. There's a few kids who need it, but most kids do really well. And look at these kids. We got 30% of the kids who do great with balanced literacy and whole language. You wouldn't want to take it away from them. They're doing great. Yes, I would like to take it away from them because all the evidence says that if we gave them systematic instruction, there would be more of those kids, and the kids who are already in that group would be doing even better.
Yeah, it's definitely something that we want to work towards, and it's essential for, everybody. And the amount of money that we're spending on these programs that aren't at that top level is a lot. And plus, with the work that you do, you see the kids that are falling through the cracks.
Yeah.
And the damage that is done and the lifelong damage that it inflicts.
So system referred children, that is children who are referred for delinquency services, for mental health services, for behavioral health services, for out-of-home care, for all those kinds of things. Children under the age of 18 who are put into the system through some doorway into the system, have very high rates of reading difficulty and very high rates of word level reading difficulty. They don't just struggle to comprehend words, they struggle to get the words off the page. 60, 70, 80% of them struggle unnecessarily to get the words off the page. It's not that they can't do it at all, but most of them do it effortfully. Even though they're in middle school and high school, they have not become graceful and fluent at this. It remains slow, it remains inaccurate, it remains difficult, it remains something that they only do with considerable effort. So even if they can do it, okay, they don't do it well, and they only do it with great effort, so they can't keep it up. We see a lot of kids in middle and high school, they can sort of just force their way through a paragraph, a page, maybe part of a chapter. But as the demand for reading goes up, they just can't do it anymore. They have no stamina because it's taking so much energy and so much effort from their brain to do this, they can't keep it up.
Yeah, it is exhausting, and it's hard that we're putting these individuals in the situation when we shouldn't.
Yeah, it was not necessary. It was not done on purpose. Nobody did it on purpose. But one of the things in our more marginalized communities, in our less privileged communities, we have them in the United States, you have them in Canada, we have them all over the world. One of the things that's happened is because these other ways of teaching have been so ineffective. We're talking about communities where 8, 9, 10, 12% of the kids are proficient readers, really abysmally low numbers. We have created a set of expectations where we don't expect these kids to read anymore. One of the things I said recently to some people is, when one white kid in a wealthy suburb fails to read, it's a disaster. When every kid in an urban classroom of children of color fails to read, it's the norm. And nobody gets upset. They just sort of shrug their shoulders. Oh, what's another class of kids who aren't going to read? Those kids don't read. And the really insulting reasoning for it is they don't have books in their house and their family doesn't read to them. And those things may be true. I think they're exaggerated. Those things may be true. That doesn't explain why these kids aren't reading, because we can teach kids to read. It's easier to teach kids to read if they come to school at 4 and 5 years old with all those good things having happened to them already. But if they haven't, we still know how to teach kids to read. It'll be harder. it'll take longer. But to just throw our hands up and say, well, people didn't read to them every night. Well, there's not enough books in the home. Well, you know, their parents aren't educated. Their parents don't model reading for these kids. So what? So they're doomed? You know, that's the message we get. That's the excuse that we have. You know, if they had just come from a wealthy white suburban family, the way we teach them to read would work pretty well. It's a shame they don't. There's nothing more that we can do. There's a lot more that we can do.
Well, and it's important to highlight that reading isn't a natural process for anyone. And that's, you know, the falsity that we hear in these things that people are saying about, oh yeah, all you have to do is read to your child and develop that love of reading. And as a parent of a severely dyslexic child, I can tell you that there was plenty of exposure to books in our home. We were reading chapter books to them at 10 months old, and we'd spend 3 or 4 hours a day reading stories to them because they loved it. And that's what they wanted. They loved
soak that stuff up.
Exactly. But finding out how to get those words off the page has not been easy for them. And they've put hours and hours and hours into intervention and are still struggling. And they've been in the right environment. They've had the proper exposure, but it's not osmosis.
My oldest son, who struggled to read, was 6 years old in the first grade, and his teacher were talking to her about his difficulties, and she said, do you read to him? And we said, yes. And she said, every night? Yeah, absolutely. Every night, more than once a night, all during the day, we read to him all the time. Her next question was, are you sure? Because her only possible explanation that she could think of for why this healthy white child from educated parents living in the suburbs wasn't reading was they must not have read to him. That was her explanation for everything. So much so that when we assured her that we read to him, she questioned if that was true, that maybe were delusional, that we imagined we were reading to him, but had gotten that, you know, like I was going to say, you know, now that you mention it, I don't think we do. You know, I don't think we've ever read to him. Wow. You know, like that was going to happen. And I explained to her, his sister, who is 4, she's in 4-year-old kindergarten this year, can read any book you have in this room. We've done the same things for him that we did for her. No different. So then the question comes, what did you do? What do you do with him when he gets to a word he doesn't know? And I said, well, as best we can, we try to help him learn the sounds and the letters and sound it out. And she says, oh, that's why he's having problems. Phonics is the problem, she said. You have to not let him do phonics. We don't want him to do phonics. Phonics is bad. And that's when I remembered my professor from graduate school, and I said, there it is. There's that crazy stuff that he warned us about that he said was coming. There it is. It's hit my son. Oh my goodness. The reason I bring that up, besides the fact that it's a pretty good story, the reason I bring that up is to draw people's attention to the origins of these other ways of identifying words. These did not come about. Guessing at words, using pictures of meaning, using the first letter and guessing the rest of it, skipping it and coming back, eagle eye and stretchy snake and all this crazy stuff that you see on bookmarks and classroom posters. None of that was because we wanted to help kids when they couldn't do phonics. So they had tried phonics, they had tried that, it didn't work, and we wanted to give them another strategy. No. All those strategies were developed out of the belief that phonics was bad. Skilled readers didn't use it. You know, if you watched my daughter read, you didn't see her use phonics. She was so good at reading, you never saw her systematically sound a word out letter by letter. When she got to a word she didn't know, she might pause for a moment, and when she said the word, she would have it right immediately almost every time. She would do that in her head, even at 4 years old. It would just come out right, like magic. And your impression watching a child like that is that the best readers don't use phonics. I see no evidence they're using phonics. So if you want to be a great reader, read like them and don't use phonics. She, in fact, was doing it. She was just doing it so gracefully and so naturally and so effortlessly, you couldn't witness her doing it. It was not obvious.
Yeah, and it really is magical. I actually have a child in that same boat. So I have them at opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And it's just like, wow. But they've had the same exposure.
They're doing the same thing that other kid has to do. They're just doing it so gracefully, you can't see them do it. It's very much like watching somebody who is a very naturally gifted dancer, and you watch them move, and then you see somebody like me who's dancing with the little feet pasted on the floor, 1, 2, 3, 4. And you say, that's not the same dance. Really, it is. If you sped it up and you did it more gracefully and you were more relaxed as you were doing it, and it happened in real time, it is the same dance. You just can't see it because one of them is very graceful and very fluent and very fluid, and the other one is very, very stuck and stodgy and step by step. So it looks like a different thing. It is not a different thing. My daughter was doing the same phonics process in her head without speaking it out loud that my son struggled to do. But in him, because he struggled at it, it was very obvious he was doing it. Because she was so good and graceful at it, it was not obvious she was doing it. And it looked like they were approaching reading in two completely different ways. As other people have said, there are not different ways to read. There are not different ways to learn to read. Everybody learns to read the same way. Every skilled reader reads the same way. Going back to what you pointed out earlier, that being able to read is not natural at all. We should not be surprised that there aren't 5 or 6 different ways to do it. It's that hard for the brain to do. There's really only one way to pull it off. And I think that's important for people to remember. And, that's not surprising. If we look at how brains move, if we look at how brains see, if we look at how brains hear, if we look at how brains speak, if we look at how brains understand speech, receptive language, anything like that, and we look at brains do it the same way. They do it with the same parts of the brain, in the same areas of the brain, in the same sequence in the brain. Some brains may be better at it. Some brains may catch on to it more quickly. Some brains may be more fluent and graceful and do it more effortlessly, but they're all doing it the same way. There aren't lots of different ways to do it.
Yeah, I just want to address a couple questions that we have in the chat. One
That's
says,
excellent.
our orthography is not governed by a simple one-to-one correspondence between graphemes and phonemes. Would orthographic mapping be supported by coming to decode and know words by also understanding their morphology and etymology?
Yeah, the more we can understand. Now, the thing about what we have to remember about the phonics, the orthography, the morphology, the etymology, all those things, teaching those things helps people. What we're always going to see, though, is that the kids who are the best at language, whose brains are just better at language, are going to take the things you teach them, then they're going to figure out a dozen other things kind of on their own. That's not evidence, again, that's not evidence that we should just teach as little as possible and let them figure out the rest on their own. For the kids who figure out the rest on their own, catch up to where they are and teach them the next thing and let them jump ahead 5 more times and just keep doing that. But for the kids who struggle, they're going to need to learn these things much more explicitly. One of the things I would point out is phonology, morphology, and etymology are certainly no more regular than phonics and orthography. They're probably much less regular. So all of this is irregular to some extent, but giving kids a background in the parts of it that are regular, that are predictable, that do follow the rules or the guides or the tendencies, if you don't like the word rules, giving them that as an anchor, as a starting point with language, puts them in a better position now to grasp and understand and become gracefully fluent and automatic with the parts that are irregular. We know that. We start out with kids reading words like dog and cat and bed. We don't ask them to read fright, might, and light, because that IGHT stuff is goofy. Nobody does that. We teach them the words. We start with the simple words that are more likely to follow the rules, that follow the rules more regularly. One of the things I'd like to point out, and I'm going to take a minute here, is I'm going to give you an example of the way you have internalized rules that you don't even know you've internalized. So what Mark Seidenberg would call statistical learning. I'm going to say two sentences. I'm going to pronounce the word the in a couple of different ways. Some of it's going to sound okay. Some of it's going to sound weird. Your brain is going to choke on it and go, that's not right. And you're all going to have the same reaction. So if I asked you to pass the butter at the Thanksgiving table or at the meal, I said, pass me the butter, that sounds fine. If I was introducing Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight champion of the world, and I said, this is Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight champion of the world, that sounds fine. If I said, this is Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight champion of the world, I've pronounced the in a different way, the heavyweight champion of the world, that sounds fine too. But if I said, pass me the butter, that does not sound fine. Your brain trips on that. There's a rule that explains that probably nobody ever taught you, but your brain has figured out without you knowing that you figured it out. The rule, if I can briefly explain it, is when the word the carries significant morphological weight. It is more than just whatever the word the is in most sentences. I don't know exactly what we would call that. I'm not a grammarian. It only gets pronounced as the. It's just a word. It serves a purpose in the structure of language, but it doesn't convey any meaning on its own. So saying the butter doesn't make any sense because it should be pronounced as the. But when we talk about the heavyweight champion of the world and say, this is Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight champion of the world, the conveys more meaning than just the word the. It is shorthand for the one and only. And then it's okay to say it is the, because the rule here is that vowels at the ends of simple words or open syllables that have little or no morphological weight, that are unstressed and carry no weight, is always pronounced as a schwa. But in this case, when the word is stressed, you notice how I say it, the heavyweight champion of the world, and it carries morphological weight. It's conveying the one and only. There's meaning in that word, important meaning in that word. Now it sounds okay. Nobody taught you that, but your brain knows it. And most of language is learned that way. Most of reading is learned that way. But we should not conclude from that learning it that way is the best way for everything to happen. We have to give you as many explicit systematic experiences as possible, as necessary, to help you to fill in the gaps around it. Some kids are going to be better at filling in the gaps than other kids. Some kids are going to be really terrible at it. And those kids are going to need an overabundance of explicit systematic instruction.
Yes. Yeah, and there's a second part to the question saying, wouldn't explicit teaching of these interrelationships between phonology, morphology, and etymology from the very beginning, for not only students who struggle, but for those who seem to read easily without much instruction, saying that the curriculum slide that we just showed seems to only mention morphology past grade 2 and 3. Now, I want to highlight that we're not, it's not saying don't teach plurals and past tense and ing. I think it's looking at more of the complex and Greek and Latin morphemes.
Right, and I'm from a camp that says, if you want to teach that this is from Greek and Latin and how all that works, great, fine. I don't know that that's absolutely necessary. I think there's a lot of things in morphology. My favorite example of more advanced morphology that I think kids really like and really kind of ignites their learning is words that include the syllable cent, spelled C-E-N-T. So percent, centigrade, century, centurion, those sorts of things, to clue them into the fact that when you see that, the number 100 lurks in the meaning here. This is of some part of 100 or 100 of something. The word 100 is involved in there someplace. That's an example for kids. Now, I wouldn't teach that necessarily to kids in kindergarten or first grade. As kids learn more, I think that's more appropriate to introduce, but there may be differing opinions on that. It's one of those things where there is no science to tell us, yes, absolutely teach this at this age, but not before this age. And don't it, that's one of those things we have to sort of figure out for ourselves. I think there is good reasoning that says I wouldn't start with morphology, but for the kids who are catching on to reading very naturally and easily, I don't think we have to hold it back from them. I don't think we have to say, hey, morphology doesn't start till third grade, so just wait for it, buddy. I think we can pump some of that morphology in there early and really ignite that curiosity and fuel that statistical learning that Seidenberg talks about. I don't think there's any reason to wait for that. That goes to the idea of differentiated instruction, not only differentiating for kids at the bottom, but differentiating for kids who are finding reading or math or anything else easier. I think it is important. There are people out there who say, look, we shouldn't start with phonics and sounds and letters. We should really start with morphology. I don't see any evidence for that. And I don't actually think it's possible. Even the people who promote it, I don't think they really mean that, because you have to start with some phonics. You have to start with some letters and sounds just to identify the morphemes. Otherwise, you're just memorizing that CNT is a morpheme that means 100, or that ing is a morpheme that comes at the end of a word that modifies the verb, without really pronouncing. I don't know what that would be like without pronouncing it, without learning that there's a letter sound correspondence. Now, on the other hand, I don't think you have to learn absolutely everything there is to know about phonics and orthography, tick every box and check every lesson before we can get into morphology. These are things that overlap in time. We start with the phonics and the orthography, and then we start introducing some simple morphology. And certainly by the time kids are in middle school and high school, most of becoming a better and better reader is about building your vocabulary, learning morphology, understanding how to, figure out words. The other thing to keep in mind is that when kids are first learning to read, they're learning to decode words that they already know orally. That would be the ideal, that kids had such a large oral lexicon that they would be learning to read and decode almost exclusively words they already know the meaning. They already know the meaning from their oral experience of the word. We're just trying to teach them to decode and recognize that word in print. So there's really no need to teach somebody the meaning of the word ball. They know what a ball is, and you don't have to teach them the meaning of a word of bike or bed or food or apple or milk or any of those things, because they already know it. Once they decode it, they go, I know what that is. It's as we get into words that are more complex, that are harder to sort out, that I kind of know what they mean, but not really, that it looks like a word I know, but I'm not sure I know this word. Then systematically teaching some morphology helps them to start figuring out the meanings of words that maybe aren't in their oral vocabulary. Because that's something that skilled readers can do. They can figure out the meaning of a word from the visual information, even though they've never encountered the word. The most interesting example is, and some of the listeners may have familiarity with this, the best example of this is organic chemistry, where if you understand the morphological rules of organic chemistry, what meta, para, and ortho mean, and what the difference between an alkane and an alkene and all this kind of stuff, what it means to have hol, H-O-L at the end of a word, or os at the end of a word. Somebody can give you the name of a molecule, of an organic molecule, and based on that, you could draw it, even if you've never seen the word before. You would understand the difference between propyl alcohol and isopropyl alcohol. The one is different from the other, and you would know what that morpheme iso means, so that you could draw it, even if nobody had ever taught it to you. They had just taught you those morphemes. That's the most profound example, I think, of the power of morphology, but that exists in a lot of areas. Once you teach kids that CENT morpheme, and then you ask them, it's fun to ask them, I'm going to teach you another word, centurion. A centurion was a Roman officer who commanded a certain number of troops. How many do you think he commanded? And they all yell 100, because they get it now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing that I like to highlight when we're talking about morphology and etymology is this requires a lot of learning on the teacher's part. And
Yes.
when we're asking for change from moving from a whole language and balanced literacy approach and going to that basic teaching the phonics and the morphemes, and we're expecting them to do all sorts of learning, adding that morphology and etymology is just too much weight to the scale, right? If they have a personal interest in it and they already know it, great. But we want to make sure that all of our students are getting access to the same materials and the same information when we're teaching them. So that's why we need to create resources that everybody can have access to. Yes, there are going to be classes where the teacher does have that background knowledge in the morphology and the etymology, so they can give those factoids while they're teaching. And that's not going to hurt the students. There's some kids that it may just go over their head and they don't necessarily understand it, but the kids that are at that level where they're absorbing more, it gives them the opportunity to get there.
Yes. And you can't teach what you don't know. You're not obligated to know absolutely everything. But I think particularly for early grade teachers, kindergarten, first, second grade, and our attention to kids beyond that who are struggling more than we would like, decoding is really critically important. There's a more recent, it's not super recent, but there's a more recent theory in understanding of reading called the decoding threshold hypothesis, which I think is going to turn out to be true. There's some really interesting evidence about it. And what the decoding threshold hypothesis says is, it says basically that the simple view of reading is correct, that comprehension of text, of written language, is the product of how well you can decode it, more or less multiplied by how well you would understand it if you heard it orally. But the decoding threshold hypothesis says that's only true if you can decode well enough. That at very low levels of decoding, what it shows, and I'll try to give you an example, is if two kids are equally poor decoders, so they're poor decoders, whatever that is, let's say they're at level 15, just a number. They're both poor decoders. And one of them is very good, has much better oral language comprehension, oral comprehension than the other, but their decoding is quite poor. Their reading comprehension might be very similar. The fact that one of them has their oral language comprehension is twice as good as the other one won't matter in their reading comprehension because they don't decode well enough. Once they decode well enough, the fact that one of them is much better at oral language comprehension will start to matter a lot to their reading comprehension. But until you can decode well enough, it won't matter. So if they're, I'll get just to sort of put numbers to it. If their decoding was a 5, they're each decoding at 5, and let's say that's a very low number. But one of them was had oral comprehension that was a 15, and the other one had an oral comprehension that was a 30. A strict reading of the simple view of reading says one of them should reading comprehend at 5 times 15, 75, and the other one should comprehend twice as good, 5 times 30, 150. What the decoding threshold hypothesis says is 5's not good enough. At 5, they're both going to still be really poor oral reading comprehenders. They're both going to comprehend at probably the same very low level. But as they start to do better and they start to decode much better, now it's going to, oral language comprehension is going to make a difference. And that's consistent with what we see from the United States NAEP data, something they did in 2018, what was called the oral reading fluency data. They looked at what's the oral reading fluency, the ability to just read words from a list, both real words and nonsense words for kids at different levels of achievement. And the kids at the bottom were almost uniformly horrible at oral reading fluency. They can't decode. The kids at the bottom don't get there. And this is for comprehension. This is purely a comprehension test. The kids at the bottom do not comprehend poorly ever, because they decode fine, but their language comprehension is poor. The only reason kids comprehend that poorly is because they can't decode the words. And at the lowest levels of reading, the problem is almost always that they can't decode the words. And keep in mind, you talk to everybody who works with these kids knows, you talk to them, you have a conversation with them, they seem to understand what's going on. Their oral language skills aren't that bad. They may not be great, but they're not that bad. Then they try to read and it's just a disaster. That's not because their oral language skills are that bad. They aren't that bad. It's because their ability to decode the word so that they then can turn it into sound and have a chance to comprehend it is just broken.
Yeah, and we really need to make sure that our interventions are addressing those skills, even if we're working with students in higher grade levels. Because, when they get into the intermediate, middle school, and high school grades, their oral comprehension is going to be hopefully better.
Right.
But if they don't have that decoding intervention, they're not going to be able to have that word recognition side of the simple view of reading. And no matter how much we work on their oral comprehension, we're not going to see the improvement in the decoding.
Right. There's very good evidence. There's an overwhelming body of evidence that says you start out and oral comprehension is really supporting your reading ability. That for young children, the fact that they have good, that's why reading to them is so important. It's not because it teaches them to read, it's because it builds their oral comprehension, it builds their vocabulary. That's why talking to children is so important and exposing them to language. It's not because it teaches them to read, but it builds their oral vocabulary, their knowledge and their experience with oral language, which gives them a tremendous foundation to start to learn to read. It makes learning to read much easier for most children. But at some point it flips around. And what happens is reading now becomes the thing that supports your continued advancement in oral reading ability, in oral language comprehension. 6-year-olds with great oral language skills, that supports their ability to learn to read. 16-year-olds who have great oral language skills, who are really advanced in oral language, that was made possible by their ability to read and their exposure to written language. That's what builds it. Up to a certain age, you learn most of your words through speaking and listening. Then it flips around and most of the words you read are really become automatic through reading and writing. So if you can't learn to decode well enough, you really get harmed in two ways, because reading and writing will be hard for you, but also your oral language is going to be held back artificially because you're not reading and writing enough to build that oral language, which is really tragic, because then if you can't decode, maybe you're so profoundly dyslexic, we still need to give you books on tape and those sorts of things. So you have these audio books. You're going to struggle to understand what you're hearing. You're not going to understand what you're hearing as well and as fluently and as quickly and as gracefully as other children, because you haven't had the experience with print that to really support that anymore. The relationship gets flipped around, and it's less oral language supporting reading. It becomes more reading supporting oral language. And so you get hurt in multiple spheres.
Yeah, you don't have that vocabulary exposure. And that's
right.
The one thing that, everyday oral discourse or communication, we're not using those complex words. We're using fairly simple words because everybody understands them. And it's not until you get into those novels and academic writing that you have the exposure to the bigger words, the more academic concepts. And if you're not getting it through reading, how else are you going to get it?
Yeah, and interestingly, in my day-to-day work, I see this fairly frequently. Really good, smart people who've been through college and been educated, but were just based on their age, were almost certainly taught to read according to whole language and balanced literacy principles, who now are working with kids who may be on medications, and they're trying to read the names of those medications, and they're leaving out most of the sounds. They're really butchering the names of these medications and oftentimes pronouncing them as familiar medications when that's not what this is. And if you were paying attention to the letters and the sounds, you would not pronounce that word that way. But they're not paying attention to those things because those skills are not as well developed in their mind and in their brain as they need to be. Reading unfamiliar pharmaceutical terms is very, very challenging. It's sort of a high-level test. You have no hope for that if you don't have really good orthographic phonological skills.
Yeah, and it's what we need to do. We need to give them to these children. So let's jump back to some of the recommendations.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is revising the early literacy resources. And the point of doing this is really to make sure that all students are getting access to the same materials and information. And it's not that we're trying to take away teacher autonomy in the sense that we don't think teachers have the ability to teach. It's that we're wanting to make sure that all the students are getting the same instruction in something that's really essential for life for them. As you've mentioned with your own work and seeing the kids that are, or the individuals that don't have those reading skills. I remember reading a report years ago saying that for 1 year for an individual to be in the juvenile justice system, whether they're incarcerated or not, it was enough to employ 2 special education teachers.
Yes.
And if that's just for 1 year, imagine what we could do if we took that money and used it to revamp the resources in the schools so that all the schools had access to quality instructional materials and the appropriate things so that teachers aren't forced to spend their own hard-earned dollars to provide their students with the resources that they need.
Yeah. Struggles and failures are enormously expensive. The consequences of those things are tremendously expensive. I work in a system that is tremendously expensive. It's cheaper than it used to be because we've gotten more efficient at it, but it is tremendously expensive. And there are way too many kids who are referred into the system. Again, what you see on the screen right now is an example of the courage to say, not only do more of this, but stop doing that. Don't do that. Now, the common objection to this is, shouldn't we have as many tools in our toolbox as possible? I don't know about your toolbox. I'm talking about my literal toolbox now, the boxes I have down in my basement at my workbench full of tools. I don't know about you, but my toolbox has a lot of crap in it that doesn't need to be there, and it's heavy, and it makes it hard for me to find what I need. I should take a lot of things out of there and throw them away. I don't need to carry 3 different kinds of hammers. I do not need to carry 17 different screwdrivers, 6 of which are exactly the same for the most part. I don't need to carry all that. So should we have as much in our toolbox as possible? No. And we should not have things in our toolbox that don't work. I have too many hammers, but at least I don't have toy plastic hammers. I don't have hammers that look like hammers but aren't really hammers. I don't have pretend wrenches that aren't really wrenches. Those kinds of things can be misleading. You have a tool that you think you can use, but it doesn't really work, and it wastes your time. One of the things I point out is, if you hired a plumber to go under your sink and work on something that was wrong, and they brought in their bucket of tools, they brought in their bag of tools, and they started digging through, and they came out with 3 tools in one hand and 5 in the other. They said, I don't know, one of these will maybe do it. You would say, I'm sorry, you can go now. I'm going to bring in somebody who's sure about what that tool is. That's what we're doing a lot of times, is we're saying, well, it's one of these. And in fact, it's always that one. It's always that one. That one is always the one. Or one very much like it is always the one. It's never these over here. You don't need to try those anymore. It's like we walk up to a building that's got 7 doors on the front of it. We're trying to figure out which one to get in. And if we're paying attention, it's always the middle door. We don't need to try the other doors. You don't need to carry keys to those doors. Those doors don't lead anywhere. They don't go anywhere. Stop carrying those keys. It just makes it harder to find the one to the door that actually leads someplace. Now that's hard for people to understand, because once we start talking about more scientific systematic methods, yeah, we want a lot of things at our disposal. You should know multiple ways of teaching phonemic awareness. You should have lots of skills for teaching phonics. You should know how to teach synthetic phonics. You should know how to teach analytic phonics. You should know how to do all these things, and you should develop some sense of when to do one and when to do the other. You should be ready, willing, and able to switch from one to the other, depending on what works for that child. But you should not say, well, phonics doesn't seem to be working. Let's go to guessing. Let's see if this kid is more of a whole word learner. There are no whole word learners. There's a video out there that I want to get permission to show. I think it comes from Stanislas Dehaene. I've seen it where other people got permission to present it. And it's a scan of the brain that's looking at electrical impulses of the brain as somebody reads a word, and it's slowed down. It shows this cascade, this wave that like passes over the brain. No matter who we do that with, the wave always starts the same way. The recognition of letters, the conversion of letters to sound, the combination of those sounds into a word, and then the triggering of the meaning of that word towards the front of your brain. It always goes from back to front. There is nobody where it starts in the front and goes to the back. Oh, I know what that word must mean. If it means that, then it must be this word. Then those must be this letters, because that's what the word is. It never goes from front to back. It always goes from back to front in skilled readers. Always, always, always. Everybody reads the same way.
Yeah, and that's important. And talking about that toolbox, when we look at the other recommendations from number 30, it's talking about replacing.
Yes.
And not keeping your old materials. It's saying, okay, we need to be, is it Marie Kondo? Take out the stuff that you don't need, remove them from your classroom, and keep the things that we need. So we're replacing the appropriate tools instead of having a bag of things that you don't need.
And that's really hard, because all of us in our work like to turn to things that are familiar with us, to us. When you pick up a tool in your hand, you want your hand to say, I felt this before, this feels good in my hand, I know what to do with this. I can hand you a tool that's a much better tool. It's a much more efficient, effective tool. But at first, it doesn't feel right in your hand. It doesn't feel good. If you're learning to do an exercise and a trainer is teaching you a different way to do it, you say, that doesn't feel right. I know it doesn't feel right, but it will feel right if you can keep this up, if you can keep doing this. Try not to go back to the old way you do it. I've had the experience, it's sort of metaphorical. I've had the experience in the last couple of years. I was diagnosed with celiac disease. I can't eat gluten anymore. I grew up, man, to me, bread and pasta and pastries is like the greatest thing in the world. I can't eat any of that anymore. And it was a very difficult process to not reach for those things when food went on the table, to not go for those things, to not walk into a store and say, I'll have 2 of those and 3 of those, because that's what I've done my whole life. It takes a while for it to be natural to say no to those things. That's a difficult process to go through. We all have habits. We all have to undo and relearn certain habits over time. This is no different.
Definitely. The report also talks about replacing and reviewing the materials so that teachers can have a go-to list of
Right.
what they can use. And I think that's really important, because there are so many resources out there, and filtering through them takes a lot of time. And, we have sites like Teachers Pay Teachers, where everybody's with the best intentions trying to get best practices out there. But I don't want my child or anybody's child's education left up to Pinterest or Teachers Pay Teachers or any of these Google searches. I want it to be evidence-based and having experts saying, yes, use these tools because they align with best practices.
Doctors don't have to figure out how to do a surgery. Doctors don't have to figure out what's the right medicine. And it's a crime that in the United States and apparently in Canada, we leave that up to teachers to figure out for themselves. One of the real lies that's been foisted on teachers is that leaving this up to them, leaving it to their best judgment, leaving it to them to discover for themselves is somehow a sign of respect for teachers. We don't want to tell you what to do. We don't want to give you these answers. We don't want to tell you what's right or wrong. You can figure that out for yourself. That's how much we respect you. Excuse my language, but bullshit. Because we don't do that to anybody else. Nobody turns to a civil engineer and says, you figure out for yourself how thick that road should be or how much steel it's going to take to hold up that bridge. We tell them, this is how much it takes. Now you design it and you incorporate those facts into what you do. We want you to use your deep training and knowledge to use these facts. We don't want you to have to spend your time figuring out the facts for yourself, where one person says, I think the road needs to be this thick, and somebody else says, I think the road needs to be this thick. That's just crazy. You take your kid to the pediatrician and they need some antibiotics. You don't want the doctor to have to decide for themselves, well, I don't know. Should I give them this much or this much? Should it be for 5 days or 10 days? I don't know. We're still working on that. I'm going to get on Doctors Pay Doctors and see what they tell me to do. Nobody would tolerate that. It's not respectful. Yeah. It's incredibly disrespectful to teachers that we do that. But many teachers have been told by the culture of teaching, and I've seen teachers say it in meetings where they get up and pound their fists and protest this. Nobody tells doctors what they have to do. Nobody restricts them. Nobody's looking over their shoulder all the time. Hey, yes, they are. They're looking over their shoulder constantly, not because we don't trust them, but because they deserve our support and our respect. Too much of what we're doing to teachers is looking over their shoulder to catch them at what they're doing, which is a terrible thing to do, instead of looking over their shoulders to support them and make sure we're giving them what they need so they don't have to go and buy this stuff for themselves and Teachers Pay Teachers and have no idea what they're getting.
Exactly. And I know, when I went through my teacher education program, there were so many questions that me and my cohort left wondering, how do we actually do this? I don't need reflections on how I felt about in the classroom. I need steps saying, this is how you teach this skill. And, I went through my teacher education program a while ago, but there's still teachers coming out of the teacher education program saying, what am I supposed to do? And I've talked to teachers that sponsor the, what do they call themselves? The student teachers. And they say, oh yeah, well, I want them from this university and not that university, because this university actually gives them some knowledge in what they need to know when it comes to teaching reading. And then this one just doesn't. So
I hope these things going on in Ontario spread a lot of places. And I hope they dramatically influence the way we prepare teachers at colleges and universities, because that's a real crime about what's going on. There are universities around the country where many of them, and around Canada too, I would imagine, where whether you get any of this knowledge or not depends on whether you just happen to choose a certain section of the reading methods class. If you choose the section taught by Professor Adams, you get one thing. If you choose the section taught by Professor Johnson, you get something else. If you choose the section taught by Professor Bates, it's something else entirely. If you go to medical school, I've never been to medical school, but if you go to medical school and you sign up for anatomy, it doesn't really, and you're going to have to, it doesn't matter which university you go to, it doesn't matter which professor teaches the anatomy class, you're all going to learn basically the same anatomy. There's not one class where they say, well, that's your liver, but that doesn't really matter. We're not going to talk about that. Nobody does that. Nobody does that. One of the things that shows us how wrong things are in the way we teach teachers to teach reading, and I'll just use reading as an example, is there are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of textbooks, many hundreds of textbooks that are used in reading methods courses. Introductory calculus has 2 textbooks that are used for almost all teaching of calculus. You use either one or the other, and they're virtually identical to each other. Same thing for introductory economics, same thing for law school, same thing for medical school, same thing for lots of things, because we've systematically agreed, this is what you need to know. This is what you have to learn. Law students at one university, when they study contract law, study the same case law as law students at another university. They don't study completely different sets of cases. One school doesn't say, we think these are the important things for you to know. Somebody says, no, we've got a completely different list of important things for you to know. The flexibility, the randomness, the variability we see in the way teachers are prepared is not a sign of respect. It's not a sign of academic autonomy. It's not a sign of academic freedom. It's a sign of disrespect. What we're really saying is, teach them whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. Go ahead. It doesn't matter what you teach them because it's not really going to matter. That's not fair. That's not right. That's not respectful.
To anyone.
Teachers deserve better than that.
Definitely. Definitely. Well, I want to be conscious of the time. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I want our listeners to make sure that they like and follow the Right to Read initiative so that they can be aware of upcoming conversations. So that being said, thank you so much.
Recognize that while you may read the Right to Read initiative, you may read the document coming out of Ontario and feel your heart lifted and feel excited. Some of your colleagues are going to be terrified by it. And that's not because they're bad people, or it's not because they're stupid. It's because they're at a different point in this journey, and helping them to see the positives in this and get over the fear, to be less anxious so that they can recognize what's good about it, is something we can do for them.
Yeah, and that's what the point of all of these conversations are. Next Tuesday, I'm talking to Dr. Pamela Snow from Australia, and we're going to look at, the process of moving from a balanced literacy instructional method to more of a structured literacy one, and the thoughts and feelings that go along with that. And I think that's a really important conversation just to be aware of, because realistically, most of the people on these calls are already on that boat,
Right.
moving towards structured literacy. But it's important to have that foundation and that support to help your colleagues along the way.
Yeah, and it's hard for people to imagine. People who are themselves very dependent on experts, people way beyond me, to help lead them forward in their journey. They feel like they're just getting started in their journey, and they realize there's so much I still need to know. That back in their school, back in their teacher's lounge, back in their conferences at their school and their meetings at their school, within your school, you may be a leader. You may be so far ahead of those people that while you are a distant follower in other settings, way behind when you go to the big conference, within your school, you may need to be a leader. So you may need to put that hat on, even though you're very conscious of how little you know. You may know more. You may be in a position to lead people who are at a certain place in the journey, and to share your experience and to be an example for them.
Yes.
Take care, everybody. Thank you for coming.